Hello, can you hear?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah. Can you come up? Yeah. Hi.
Yeah.
Hello.
Sure. Okay.
Right. Good morning to the attendees from Colombo and good afternoon to the speakers from Tokyo. I'm Chandana Veerasena, Charge Affairs, Sri Lanka Embassy, Tokyo. Mr. Samantha Vijayasekara, Minister Commercial of this embassy, is also with me to welcome all of you to this webinar. Mr. Vijayasekara is my co-partner in organizing this event from this embassy. The Ministry of Foreign Relations has been playing a vital role in promoting economic relations with foreign countries through its economic diplomacy program since 2018. While the ministry is working with line ministries and agencies in Sri Lanka, all our missions abroad have also been given economic targets to achieve as front runners in overseas capitals. Amidst the current economic challenges due to COVID-19, the role of Sri Lanka missions has been further augmented to reinforce this economic diplomacy program for a better economic recovery. The pandemic has disrupted most economies in the world in areas of exports and imports, trading, foreign direct investments, global supply chains, manufacturing, financial mechanisms, equity markets, logistics, and many more. Sri Lanka has no exception. The challenges are enormous. In this backdrop, our embassy in Tokyo is also trying its best to facilitate the ministry, line ministries, and Sri Lankan business community for a better outcome. We are aware that the post-COVID economic recovery will not be easy. Universally, it will be very challenging. In the case of Japan, the current government under the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is exploring new strategies to stabilize the economy first and then sustain it in medium and long run. Among these strategies, enhance and resilience of supply chain is one of the important subjects which is being discussed today. It is also an interesting subject, especially to countries like Sri Lanka. We, the embassy, is of the view that when Sri Lanka is formulating new strategies for a better post-COVID economic recovery, it would be important for Sri Lankan policymakers as well as to the business community to understand the real challenges and then clear their paths, resolve ambiguities, and seek opportunities. It will also be useful to do our own homework and make important decisions at this crucial time. For this purpose, we have 3 Japanese experts to speak to you. Before I hand over to our moderator, Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, I take this opportunity to thank first to our speakers from Japan. Ms. Shihori Maeda, Deputy Director, South Asia Division of the Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry, and Mr. Ken Koyanagi, Editor-at-Large, Nikkei Asian Review, and Mr. Ryo Okochi, Partner, Anderson Mori and Tomatsune. Secondly, I must thank Ambassador Ravinath Arisinghe, Secretary Foreign Relations, Ambassador P.M. Mamsa, Additional Secretary Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Relations, for their guidance and leadership for this event. Let me also thank Mr. Prabhash Subasinghe, Chairman, Sri Lanka Export Development Board, and his staff for jointly working with us to host this webinar from Colombo. I also thank Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, the Executive Director, Lakshman Kadragama Institute, for accepting our invitation as the moderator for this event. Let me also thank all attendees to this webinar. I'm sure this would be useful for you. I especially thank Mr. Miyake Yasujiro of the Japanese Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry, and Ms. Kayoko Hayama of Nikkei newspaper in organizing speakers. Finally, let me extend my sincere appreciation to my team at the embassy for making this event a reality. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to invite Dr. Vignaraja to commence this webinar. Dr. Vignaraja, I think you can start now.
Thank you very much, Chandana, and it's a great pleasure to be moderating this session on post-COVID economic recovery, dealing with challenges, opportunities, and tips for Sri Lanka. By way of background for the audience, this COVID pandemic has brought an unprecedented health crisis, but also an economic crisis globally. World growth since 2008 was already fairly tepid, has taken a dive, and the International Monetary Fund a few days ago talked about minus 4.9% global growth for 2020, but they talk about a V-shaped recovery in 2021. Now, Asia is, of course, the big trade player in the world, and Japan is an important actor in that trade game. It has been hit somewhat less hard. The IMF projects that Asian growth will be only minus 0.8% in 2020, and there's a sharper V-shaped recovery next year. So for governments in general, the focus is, of course, on protecting the people and dealing with the public health emergency. But of course, at the same time, the concept of the economic recovery is very important. And for us today, the big issue is how do we turn the crisis into an opportunity so that we get win-win in trade and investment and other economic opportunities across Asia and the Pacific. And Japan and Sri Lanka, of course, are very old friends. It goes back to the San Francisco conference where Sri Lanka, supported Japan in many ways after the Second World War, and that friendship has extended through with Japan being a very ardent development and supporter of Sri Lanka. But somehow when one looks at the information there, we feel that the potential for trade, investment, and other economic ties isn't quite as well realized. And so, the areas of global supply chains, which Japan is particularly famous for, services trade, which is increasingly an important area for Japan, the migration of skilled workers into Japan, tourism, foreign aid, these are all areas that are important, but not quite as even as from the Sri Lankan point of view. So the focus today, I think, for our session, there are three big questions. The first is, what is the state of play in Japan-Sri Lanka trade and investment ties and other ties? Second, what are the opportunities for closer ties on the economic front? But also, what are the constraints? Why isn't this happening? And third, what needs to be done on the part of Sri Lanka and then on the part of Japan to make a vision into a reality? And I think that's our big issue. To address these important issues, as Chandana said, we have a terrific and very diverse panel from Japan, and we are very privileged to have the colleagues here. We have Shirohori Maeda, who's Deputy Director at Japan's, basically their Ministry of Trade and Industry. We have Ken Koyanagi, who is Editor-at-Large at Nikkei Asian Review. And we have Ryo Okuchi, who is partner at Anderson, Mori and Tomasuni, which is a law firm which handles, of course, other professional services. Now, I was going to propose that each of the speakers speaks for 10 to 15 minutes. Koyanagi-san may speak for a little longer, and I may ask some questions of each, and then we will also have some audience questions as we go along. I wonder, is Maeda-san there? Could she start by giving her few remarks, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So shall I start now? Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Shirohori Maeda, Deputy Director of Southwest Asian Office of METI. First of all, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to talk in this seminar. Today, all countries are facing the threat of COVID-19, and global economic activities have been shrinking. I pay my respect for Sri Lankan government and the Embassy of Sri Lanka holding a webinar which will help deepen Japan-Sri Lanka bilateral economic relationship, although we are in such a difficult time. The impact of COVID-19 is extensive. Japanese government have introduced several emergency economic measures, especially for SMEs, which are affected more seriously than others. And moreover, Japanese government introduced measures to maintain employment for companies regardless of their size. Triggered by global restrictions on cross-border traffic in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chains of goods important for people's well-being, and their economic activities has been disrupted. It has caused shortage of various products in many countries around the world, including Japan. These disruptions are primarily caused by the fact that the global supply chains has been left vulnerable due to a high degree of concentration of the production base. Based on such experience, to minimize the risk of a disruption to the supply of important goods in the event of an unexpected crisis, it is necessary to establish a sustainable and reliable supply system through diversification of the production base, especially in the Asian region. In particular, regarding products essential for people's well-being, it is crucial to secure domestic production base to ensure there's a stable supply in case of emergencies. This program is included in the stimulus package to provide support to voluntary corporate initiatives for the purpose of enhancing their supply chain resilience. The total package budget for the program is 243.5 billion yen, and the program for diversification of manufacturing base in Asia is passed the cabinet for 2.35 billion yen. Since the necessary measures vary depending on the type of products, the program offers a variety of options for financial support, not only for the introduction of facilities and equipment, but also for demonstration projects and feasible studies so that the business may engage in optimal decision-making. Learning from supply chain disruptions caused by COVID-19, some Japanese companies started to consider their supply chain diversification. There were some cases that the companies faced stoppage of manufacturing due to a lack of parts of the product, and they recognized the importance of enhancing their resilience by supply chain diversification. Then where will they make investments, right? One of the critical elements influences the investment decision is whether a country has a good business environment. Attracting FDI is under global competition, and it is important for Sri Lanka that it becomes an attractive FDI destination for business and trade, regardless of COVID-19. When Japanese companies consider making a new investment in a country, they will try to get as much as information as possible, including the current situations that Japanese companies are facing in the country. Thus, solving issues that Japanese companies are facing in Sri Lanka also help improving the image of business environment in Sri Lanka and help attracting new investment. Moreover, most of Japanese companies are SMEs, not large companies. Therefore, relaxation of some regulations or introducing SME-friendly regulations will help attract investment. For example, I heard that Sri Lanka has a requirement that a foreign company needs to invest $250,000 as a minimum initial investment in order to get business approval from BOI. Relaxation of such regulations will make Sri Lanka easier for SMEs to consider it as FDI destination. Japan and Sri Lanka have been discussing business environment issues in Sri Lanka through Japan-Sri Lanka Government-Private Joint Forum held by Embassy of Japan and JCCISL, Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Sri Lanka. METI and Japanese companies consider important to have, one, information sharing and grace period mechanism for changes in policy, law, rule, regulation, taxation, and others. And two, fast track mechanism at customs. And three, PPP scheme from the perspective of improving business environment in Sri Lanka. These issues have not been solved yet, so we hope that discussions between Japan and Sri Lanka will deepen further. Last but not least, having FTA regionally and globally is also important as an investment environment. Thus, building strategic FTAs with some countries like ASEAN, for example, may strengthen the supply chain in Asia for Japanese companies. METI will continue to put its efforts to develop win-win relationship with Sri Lanka. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Maeda-san. That was a very comprehensive presentation. And the couple of takeaways that I got from it, one is that Japan is being very active in restructuring its supply chains to make sure they're much more predictable, going forward in the new COVID world. And that means companies are looking to move out of some areas into others, which is the opportunity. And Japanese government is providing this big program. If I got your number right, it's 2.35 billion yen, which is a big number to help that transition. And of course, there's a global competition that we see for FDI, and countries which have a more conducive business environment, very broadly defined, are more likely to see success than perhaps other environments. And there were some specific details which we will come back to in the chat on what that might be. And then the other really important point I picked up was that Japanese companies willing to invest in a country like Sri Lanka or anywhere else will often talk to Japanese companies in that country. And so this information sharing is very important, in terms of understanding the dialogue. So dialogue is not only with the new investors, but also the existing investors. I hope that's a summary of some of the things that you said. Koyanagi-san, may I kindly invite you now to make your presentation? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wagner Raja. Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Koyanagi. I'm a Nikkei reporter for the past 32 years or so. First based in Tokyo and then Silicon Valley in the US, back in Tokyo, and then moved to Singapore for 1 year and lived in Bangkok for 3 years, and then in Mumbai, India for 2 years and 3 months. But the past 2 months or so, I've been evacuated in Tokyo because India completely shut down international flights in late March. So I think I'm going to talk about all those experiences in recent years in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and give some, I don't know, suggestions or hints, tips for Sri Lanka to come back stronger after the COVID-19 crisis. I'm going to share slides I prepared. I'm not going to go through every slide in detail because it's going to take an hour, I think. So, okay. So first, I want to start with where the Sri Lanka is. So Sri Lanka GDP per capita, looking at it, this country, your country, I would say, has been doing pretty good, actually. It's been doing far better than India, for example. 2018 India GDP per capita was a little bit above 2,000 versus Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a little bit above 4,000. So it's double better than India, although they are very, very close together. And if you go to Sri Lanka, I have been to Sri Lanka for just 1 week for vacation, but I was very impressed by the cleanliness of streets and roads and houses and restaurants and hotels, people's civility. People are very civilized in Sri Lanka. They're very kind, very welcoming, very communicative, and you don't have to be really alert every time so that you don't get robbed or something, which in many cases the case in India. Actually, you have to be alert when you're walking on the streets in many places in India. So I was very impressed, and looking at all those reports and researches, especially by Japanese companies, they all say Sri Lankan people are good. The workers are diligent, they're well educated, they behave themselves, they come to the office on time, they speak English, and they're good at a very precise work. So many Japanese companies value the quality of human resources in Sri Lanka. So I think Sri Lanka has been doing good. And also, despite the fact that the GDP per capita is double the India, twice as high as India, its labor cost is not very high, actually. This is results of JETRO survey. Actually, if you look at the second last city, which is Colombo, the labor cost at the manufacturing plant workers is just it's an annual cost. It's a little bit over $2,000 US, a little bit higher than Dhaka, which is Bangladesh, and also a skilled engineer in manufacturing sector, it's a little bit over 4,000, which is actually lower than Dhaka, and it is surprisingly low in terms of labor costs. So if you're looking at inviting manufacturing sector FDIs, I think in terms of the labor costs, Sri Lanka is not bad in positioning, and this chart shows that. This is by the way, this cost includes everything from salary to social security and bonuses and other benefits. So it's a real annual labor cost for Japanese manufacturers. So Sri Lanka is very well positioned in terms of FDI introduction. And what's going on in the world right now, as you know, because of the trade war between China and the US, there are significant amount of relocation of manufacturing sites, production sites out of China towards other locations, and especially Vietnam and Thailand, and a little bit of Cambodia and Bangladesh and Philippines and Indonesia. Those countries are winning those relocation moves. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka is not among them, and also India is not among them because of a lot of difficulties I'm going to talk about later. So this is a comparison of FDI from Japan to Asia Pacific countries. China by far the biggest. Of course, the US is far larger than China, but China is the biggest among Asia Pacific countries. Singapore, Thailand, a fair amount of FDI from Japan continuing. And if you look at Sri Lanka, you cannot say it is a decent amount. It's very, very little, almost negligible amount actually. And this year, 17 was larger than 18. 18 was far smaller than this. So to put it in a very positive ways, we have a big room for FDI increase from Japan to Sri Lanka. That's what I have to say. And this is a timeline of Japanese FDIs to Sri Lanka. It's go up and down, but it's staying in between somewhere between 7 to 50 million US dollars. So I think we have a room to raise this into 100 million or even a billion if right policies are put in place. That's a potential we have in the bilateral investment relationship. So what kind of companies are already in Sri Lanka? As you know, DIC, Dainippon Inki in older name, and FDK Noritake. These manufacturers have been operating in Sri Lanka for quite a long time actually, and especially Noritake is very famous. And of course YKK, those are famous. And there are some engineering companies. They are building, bridges, dams, power plants, etc. And then, of course, trading houses, major trading houses are there, and also marine transportation services as well. But we note that there is a lack of real major players like Toyota or Nissan, Hitachi, or those major manufacturers are not in Sri Lanka yet, I would say. And that's where we stand, where Sri Lanka stands right now. This is a result of survey of by JETRO of Japanese companies operating in Sri Lanka, whether they are willing to increase their operation, increase their investment in Sri Lanka. The purple line, as you see, purple line is Sri Lanka. The basic trend line is increasing. Basic trend line is increasing, as opposed to India and Bangladesh. They are at high level, they are decreasing. So the interest in expanding investments in India and Bangladesh are kind of declining. So Sri Lanka is in a good momentum, I would say. So Thailand and Vietnam turned out to be very popular destinations for Japanese companies, especially after China-U.S. relationship has been soured. I think Vietnam popularity has risen quite considerably. And so this is a very interesting survey done by JETRO again, of 3,000 plus Japanese companies operating in Asia Pacific, and they asked what kind of elements or factors they appreciate in certain economy. For example, Japanese companies tend to appreciate friendliness to Japanese. And the 60% of the respondents said Taiwan is very friendly and we appreciate it, for example. And number two was Thailand. 48% of those respondents answered they appreciate Thai friendliness to Japanese. And number three is Vietnam. 42% said so. Next, they said it is very, very convenient to have their clients around them. Client abundance. 33% of those respondents answered Mexico was very convenient because they have their clients around them, close to them. And number two, South Korea, 32% said so. And then number three, there's Thailand, and then China. And next, supplier abundance, meaning they have suppliers around them, close to them in certain economy. 21% voted China as a good place because of the supplier abundance. And number two, that was Thailand. 18% said they have abundance of suppliers close to them in Thailand. And then ease of living for expats. It's a living condition in general. Singapore, as you know, it's a very safe place to live in, and everything is around. Very clean place, very stable place. Singapore, UK, US, these are advanced economies. And then number four was Thailand. Thailand, 70% of those Japanese companies said Thailand is good for them because living experience for their Japanese workers, Japanese employees is very good. And I think this is one of the strengths of Thailand. All others are advanced economies. If you look at the 5 best votes, it's Singapore, UK, US, and Germany, and then Thailand is among them. So I think that Thailand has a very, very advantageous living conditions around. And now, and also, actually, Thailand has a very good physical infrastructure. If you only stay in Bangkok, you see a very terrible congestion, traffic jams all the time. But once you get out of Bangkok, you find a very, very well-developed road network. Actually, it reminds me of US interstate highway network, and a very clean road, every 5 kilometers or so, there are a gas station and then cafe, convenience store, etc. So it is a very, very comfortable road trip. It's amazing, actually. Compared to other places in like Indonesia or India I have been, or even Laos, if you travel on the road, you have a very, very hard time. Roads are not flat in the first place. Very narrow lane, many accidents, old cars. The difficulty in road trip and road transportation is very high in other developing Asian countries. But Thailand, especially road transportation, is exceptionally good. So 12% of Japanese companies see Thailand infrastructure as a positive. And then availability of workforce and land space availability, those are the two fields Japanese companies appreciate about Vietnam. So Vietnam, they have a very good workforce at the affordable cost. That's, I think, the strongest point of Vietnam today. And also land space, land and office space affordability is also the strength. And then tax regime is, of course, important. Thailand ranks second, although it is 6% votes. So it's not very high, but relatively Thailand and Vietnam number 3, they have a competitive advantage in these fields. And looking at this, as I talked initially, so Sri Lanka has a very high quality human resource. That's my impression. And if you look at statistics, it is good. Sri Lanka, it's an adult literacy rate. It's over 90%, which is far better than India. And also, this is a secondary school enrollment, net enrollment. Sri Lanka is very high, even higher than Vietnam. Although Vietnam, it's a completion rate. It's not net enrollment. So I think the figures are similar. But Sri Lanka is doing very good in terms of secondary education. I think Dr. Wignaraja mentioned the importance of high value added service sector. So this is, I think, a hurdle for Sri Lanka. It's a tertiary school gross enrollment, which is relatively low compared to its secondary school enrollment, which is very high. So I think the reinforcement of colleges and universities and post-high school education in Sri Lanka is very important to further development of higher value added service sector. And I think best practices in Asia Pacific, FDI promotion and FDI-led economic development are Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. They tell us a lot of things. We need a lot of things in place. But one thing I want to notice is policy consistency and predictability. In some countries, the politicians suddenly change regulations and policies all of a sudden. Especially if you're living in India, there's one day there's TV announcement by prime minister or trade minister, completely changing FDI rules on certain sector to protect domestic SMEs or domestic pressure groups like small traders. And this kind of inconsistency, unpredictability are the biggest hurdles for any foreign companies or foreign investments. So I think this is very important to keep in mind to secure policy consistency and predictability, despite all those regime changes and electoral administration changes. I think this is very, very important. And also education is very, very important. And also departure from import substitution is very, very important as well. In other words, if the policies and politics are too nationalistic, regarding economy. That's, I think, a road to a failure. And that's exactly how India economy is proceeding these days. They're becoming increasingly more and more protective and nationalistic. And yesterday they banned 56 Chinese mobile apps because of the border disputes. So these kind of emotional, non-logical, nationalistic economic policies are very, very harming for the economic development. And import substitution doesn't work. That's been already proved by many cases. But politicians like import substitution because it's very appealing to nationalistic voters. So import substitution is a very playable toy for populists, but it's a very, very dangerous trap for an economic development. That's what I have been observing for recent years in Asia. And this is another list of to-do list for Sri Lanka, I think. Sri Lanka's ease of doing business ranking in World Bank ranking is 99. Not very good. And while comparing to these countries, the starting a business is relatively good, but other than that, trading across borders and enforcing contracts, they are not doing very good. I think these fields, trade policies, and enforcing contracts, this is legal infrastructure, I think. These are the things that politics can improve a lot by their will. And the same problems are shared by India as well, actually. India enforcing contracts ranking is 163 countries out of 190 countries. There are difficulties to make customers pay by the due date. First of all, in many cases, you have to make a lawsuit in court to just collect the money, or just to make them repay the debt. There are always court process involved. So it's very, very difficult to your counterparty to fulfill their promise. That's a basic problem in doing business. So I think this is a field where Sri Lanka can work on eagerly. And this is, again, JETRO survey, what problems they are seeing in each economy, in each South Asian economy. And Sri Lanka, the top of the list was difficulties in local procurement of raw materials. Well, this is not something, I think it is, Sri Lanka is a very small country and you don't have a full list of industries. So it's a kind of difficult requirement for Sri Lanka to fulfill. But other than that, the difficulties in staffing, this reflects a kind of shortage of workforce. Sri Lanka has only 20 million people. So this is something probably you cannot help. But labor cost rises, you can control probably, and difficulties in product quality control. This is again, I think this is something that private sector can work on. Difficulties in cost reduction. I don't know. This is about land cost, office cost. I don't know. But these are the things Japanese companies listed as issues. And lastly, I think this is my proposal. I think apart from the quality of human resource, the biggest advantage of Sri Lanka is geographical position. This is a gateway to India subcontinent, and then this is a gateway to the entire Indian Ocean economies. So I think there must be a strategies to take the most of this geographical positioning and location. And probably that's a kind of proactive, voluntary modification, addition to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is led by China. Probably there should be a Sri Lankan version of BRI, which connects East Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, even US, to the Indian subcontinent and Africa. And that's one proposal I have. Also, all the successful developing economies in Southeast Asia, they have a very good industry policies, target industries to nurture. And that's something I think Sri Lankan politicians may want to work on to develop. I think I talked already too much, so I hand it over back to you, Dr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was a really insightful presentation. And what I take away from that is Sri Lanka's strategic advantages relate to the geography, a very strategic location in the Indian Ocean, and a solid labor force, which is relatively low cost relative to its skill level, but that's for manufacturing. But there are these gaps in tertiary level, which will hinder services. And then the big issue, which also Maeda-san talked about, was the business environment, where Sri Lanka is not necessarily seen as so business friendly. On the one hand, that's the red tape issue, but then the broader issue of the subcontinent, with India in particular, is this lack of policy predictability and consistency. And then you talked about, of course, the constraint of the small market, meaning the import substitution type policy, which again is there in South Asia, and then increasingly this economic nationalism, which is there in South Asia. You mentioned the Indian case and so on. And the last point I thought was very interesting is that you talked about an Indian Ocean strategy, which Sri Lanka is now articulating. Many governments have been talking about. But then the other part that you talked about in the piece was this idea of a targeted industrial policy to try to attract investors and others. So I think you gave us a lot of food for thought. Let me now go to Rio to give us a perspective, from his specialized advantage as a lawyer, but also maybe on this question of modern services and whether, Sri Lanka is an apt location for that type of product. Please, Rio, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wagner Raja. Hello, I am Ryo Okochi, lawyer, a Japanese lawyer of Anderson Mori and Tomotsune, which is a Japanese law firm. My office is located in Tokyo, but from here I am working on South Asia transactions. I had experience living in India, New Delhi, in 2008. And at that time, I was working with an Indian law firm. That is Amarchand Mangaldas. You may have the name. But since then, I'm working in relation to the transaction, especially M&A transactions in South Asia regions. So today I would like to share my experience and my view from that perspective. I will show you my slide, which talk about my experience. Just a minute, please. Okay, so today I'd like to do some comparative view by region. Actually, Mr. Koyanagi already did a similar thing, but I hope I can add something to his remarks or explanation. So let's start with China and Korea, which is very close to Japan. China's advantage is, of course, their number of population. They have a huge number of population. And Korea, of course, that is much smaller than China's population, but they also have a good population. And a good advantage of them, in addition to Japan transaction, is they are very close to Japan. And not only geographically, but also our culture is very close. And we also share some culture like J-pop music, K-pop music, movies, and even manga, comics. We share a lot of same things among us. According to Mr. Koyanagi's presentation, friendliness is important for business people, and maybe this kind of sharing culture is helping China and Korea. Unfortunately, we have some political issues in terms of history. With China, recently our relationships is getting better or stable, but unfortunately, relationship with Korea is not as good as before. We will see how the things will develop, but that is one difficulty about China and Korea. And we go into Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries. So they are also a good destination for Japanese companies to invest in. They also have good number of population, and location is relatively close. And about culture, it's less than China and Korea. We share what we share, but good enough, they also know our culture, and we also know their culture as well. Then let's move to the next slide. The next slide talk about South Asia and Africa. So in addition to South Asia, population is good for India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. But as we discussed, population of Sri Lanka is relatively small. So that is the difficulty. The location, it's a little far compared to ASEAN countries, but still within the good reach, I think. The problem is, I think, culture, understanding of the respective culture, because I think people in Sri Lanka do not much about Japanese culture. Of course, you know, like Japanese food, like sushi or tempura, but actually that is not everything about Japanese foods. And so we have some difficulty in commonality about the culture. Instead, we don't have much political issues. Actually, as Dr. Wagner just said, we are old friends, old good friends, I think. So that is the overview of the South Asia. And I would like to add Africa. I would like to look at Africa as well. Africa is very far from Japan. It's far from Japan geographically. And if you see flight connections, it's not as good as those two European countries, EU countries. So for Japanese people, Africa is geographically and mentally very far from Japan. But the current Japanese government is looking at Africa very eagerly. And last year, we had a TICAD conference in Japan. The TICAD conference is an international conference between Japan and African countries. A lot of African people, diplomats, and business players visited Japan last year. And this event is promoted by our Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He is very supportive about business development between Japan and African countries. And I talk about this more later. So I would like to talk about advantage of Sri Lanka, what Sri Lanka have right now. And that was also covered by Mr. Koyanagi as well, but I would like to repeat this because this is very important. So first of all, Sri Lanka have a good advantage about the language because you speak English. There is no local language requirement. If you want to do the business in China, you have to learn Chinese. And if you have to do business in Indonesia, you have to learn the Indonesian language. And especially, in particular, in addition to Indonesia, they have a requirement to execute a contract in their local language if the contract is between the Indonesian people and the foreigner. Therefore, and if there is no local language, that contract cannot be enforced. That is pretty much a hardship for Japanese companies to do the business in Indonesia. But in Sri Lanka, there is no such requirement. And if I talk about restriction on investment from overseas, of course, Sri Lanka has some restrictions, but if we compare that with other countries in Asian region, it's relatively less restrictive, I would say. For example, when you are in Thailand, and if you want to do a business of service in the service industry, you need to set up a joint venture. It's inevitable. So you have to have a local partner. So if Japanese companies want to do the business in the service industry in Thailand, you need a joint venture partner, a local partner. This requirement is actually not very big hardship for Thailand and Japanese people because it's not strictly regulated. So a joint venture partner can be a nominal partner. They own the shareholding, but they don't have a veto or something like that. But still, there is a restriction like that. And if you go to Malaysia, they have a Bumiputera policy. So the name is not Bumiputera policy, but the objective of the policy is to protect native Malaysian people. There is no such restriction in Sri Lanka. So that is a good advantage. And in terms of exchange control, I also see less restriction in Sri Lanka if we compare it with India. India has a lot of restrictions. India has more restriction even compared to ASEAN countries. That is India's probably most worst hardship for Japanese companies. And when we look at education, good literacy rate, so good for service sector, or even for the manufacturing sector, it is good for skilled workers. And finally, the location. And I would like to emphasize this advantage, especially for Africa, because Sri Lanka is close to Africa. So Sri Lanka can be a foothold to invest in African countries. And here I would like to bring one example from India-Japan promotion. So Japanese government is promoting the business with Indian companies or Indian government to invest in jointly in African countries. So from Sri Lanka, from India. So Japan and India are cooperating to invest in African countries. So Japanese companies have resources like technologies, human resources, and capital. And Indian people has a good connection with African people, companies, so they can collaborate to explore the African market. Likewise, Sri Lanka people or companies may explore such opportunities. And another location is Singapore. Of course, Sri Lanka is close to Singapore. And nowadays, Japanese companies, they are shifting some governance control to Singapore subsidiary. So they are now putting a Sri Lanka subsidiary as a headquarter of APAC region. So if for Japanese companies, if Sri Lanka is far, maybe Sri Lanka companies try to contact Singapore subsidiary of Japanese company. There may be an opportunity to work with Singapore subsidiary of Japanese companies. I saw some transaction like that, and after the collaboration with Singapore subsidiary, Japanese company had a direct transaction with Japanese company. So it may be a good start if Sri Lanka companies work with Singapore subsidiary first. So you can look at not only Tokyo, but also Africa and Singapore when you talk about Japanese companies. Okay. So today's seminar's objective is to find out challenges and opportunities and tips for Sri Lanka companies and people. So as we discussed, we have, Sri Lanka has a good advantage. But the problem is, do they know it? My question is, do they know it? And they mean Japanese people. So do Japanese people know such good advantage? And another question is, do you know them? Here, I mean, do you know such advantage? Do Sri Lanka people know such advantage? And also, do Sri Lanka people know Japanese people and company? As we discussed, learning the counterpart and build a friendship is good for business as well. So these two questions I would pose to you and would like to discuss today. Okay, so that is all from me. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rio. That was, again, a very insightful and practical presentation. And I picked up from that the location issue, which was mentioned earlier, and you deepened the idea that Sri Lanka's location also meant it was conveniently located to Africa. And that would be another key opportunity for Sri Lanka, building on your experience of the Japan-India partnership for Africa, which I think is a very useful point. The other locational point you built up was the question of Singapore in this triangular cooperation with Japanese companies already have this link, and you're shifting many of your regional headquarters and their functions to Singapore. And that is another important opportunity for Sri Lanka to access Japan through their headquarters in Singapore. So that becomes very important. And then you mentioned, I think, the very important issue of the business culture and getting to know your clients, and also for Sri Lankans to understand Japanese culture. And I will come back to some of those points in the chat. So I think we had some very interesting questions. Now, I will pose a couple of questions to our panelists while giving our audience the opportunity to also pose some questions online. I think there is a Q&A function that is there, which you can pose your question, and I will try to pick those up so that we can have a discussion. We have a few minutes for the chat. Isn't that right, Chandana? We have about half an hour potentially, right?
Yes, yes, Dr. Vivian, you can go ahead. Yes.
Right. So we will have a Q&A session, and then at the end of the Q&A session, I will give maybe a chance for 1 minute each to our main speakers to give one main tip for Sri Lankan business and government if we want to. So if you can think of 1 or 2 main tips, I will give you a chance at the end to restate your point so that it's very clear, and then I will try to summarize at the end. So let me start with some questions building on these presentations. Let me start with Maida-san. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how the Japanese government is allocating this financial package to Japanese companies interested in locating to Asian countries, moving out the supply chain. That is one question. How is Japan doing this? Is it a competitive basis? Is it on the basis of proposals? The second question I wonder is if you can tell us a little more about how, when your Japanese government is advising Japanese companies about moving internationally, how important this link between Japanese companies in a country like Sri Lanka is and potential investors is, and as a source of information, and what might Sri Lanka do to improve that communication with Japanese companies already here? Please, if you could deal with those 2 questions, I would be very grateful. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So first, for the first question, hold on. Well, this financial support, so we give some financial support, not only for the introduction of facilities and equipment, but also for the demonstration projects and the feasibility studies so that the business may engage in optimal decision making. That's the basic of this program. And we already invited some companies to how to say, say, like, like I'm interested in this project. And then we are actually under the independent decision making, like, which project we would accept as this financial support program. And then also I also would like to emphasize this. So this program is providing support for voluntary corporate initiatives for the purpose of a diversification of their production base. This is not like designed to facilitate business to either relocate their production base to other countries or reshore them back to Japan. What I mean is that it's okay to have their facility, continue to have their facilities in the country that they are having right now. It's just when you think about, what we learned from the COVID-19 is that if one thing's happened and if it happens globally, well, there are some time lags. And if one happens in China, well, then next few months later, that similar thing happened in Japan, Sri Lanka, and other countries, right? So what we are trying to do is to diverse the supply chain, not only having one production base in one country, but try to have another one in another country. That's the basic of this program. So I just want to emphasize on that. I heard that this program actually, closing invitation of the project for the first time. Well, there will be a second one, probably in August. So that could be another opportunity for Japanese companies who are thinking about diversification of a supply chain. Okay, and then for the second question, the communication with Japanese companies in Sri Lanka. Well, I think like probably all of you know that JETRO is a kind of information hub for Japanese companies, and JETRO has their office in Sri Lanka too. So most of the Japanese companies who are interested in investing in Sri Lanka, well, they will access JETRO in Japan and also in Sri Lanka. That's their information hub. And also they have, Japanese companies often have, Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry in any countries where they have a business operation. So Japanese Chamber of Commerce is also one of the information sources that Japanese companies always get access to.
Thank you very much. I want to ask Koyanagi-san, this question of free trade agreements, in Sri Lanka's small market of 22 million, how important would, a free trade agreement with India that is upgraded, because we only have a very limited goods agreement now, and how important would be this trade agreement between Sri Lanka and Singapore be to further potential ties, particularly from Japanese investors? And what is the role of free trade agreements, basically, in furthering business ties and the movement of supply chains? I wonder if you might give us your perspective and what it also means for a country like Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Okay. I think it's very, very important. Especially FTA with India is critically important for Sri Lanka to function as a gateway to the Indian subcontinent for foreign companies. And actually, I'm not very familiar with details of the FTA, current existing FTA with India, but I think the more comprehensive, the better. That's what I think. And that would make it possible for Sri Lanka to function as a kind of another state of India. So if you have a regional logistics or management hub in Sri Lanka, they could function as a kind of South Asian regional headquarters. And that would make Sri Lanka a tremendous advantage because it's easier to live in Sri Lanka than to live in India itself, especially for Japanese people. So I think it gives a huge advantage to Sri Lanka to attract Japanese FDIs. So I think it's a very good strategy to develop this existing FTA into a more comprehensive one. That's one thing. And also, I think Singapore FTA is also very important. And also, I think it's a one step towards a larger FTA or free trade arrangement between ASEAN and Sri Lanka. So both this India Sri Lanka FTA and ASEAN Sri Lanka FTA arrangements would make Sri Lanka as a kind of junction between ASEAN and Indian subcontinent. And if it comes with a lot of tax incentives or investment incentives, that would make Sri Lanka function as a less costly regional hub location for many Japanese businesses that aspire to expand their businesses into Indian subcontinent as well as into Africa. So I think the FTA strategy will be very, very important for Sri Lanka. Even maybe you can think about FTA arrangements with Japan, South Korea, or China, and or EU. I mean, you can expand those arrangements a lot. And that's a basic strategy of Singapore, by the way. And that has been working quite well. So I think you can learn lessons from Singapore in that free trade strategy.
Thank you. That's very useful information. For Maeda-san, for Rio, I have a question. Could you tell us a little bit about, you said culture was terribly important and people don't understand culture. Could you tell us what type of business culture might Japanese firms be interested in from Japanese joint venture partners, say Sri Lankan joint venture partners to Japanese companies? What kind of culture might you like to have? And then what sort of culture might Japanese companies be interested in to see from Sri Lankan workers? So first the companies who might be joint venture partners in Sri Lanka to Japanese companies. And secondly, what kind of culture might you expect from Sri Lankan workers? What these Edo rules and things like that. I wonder if you can explain that in a brief sense for our Sri Lankan audience, so they understand what it takes for Sri Lankan firms to become joint venture partners to a Japanese firm, or Sri Lankan workers to be employed by a Japanese firm. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Well, actually, what Japanese company expect from Sri Lanka company or employees are very universal things. So from a company, Japanese company would expect trust, cooperation, partnership, and from employee, diligence, and again, cooperation. So I think it's a universal all over the world. The problem is, although Sri Lanka company and the Sri Lanka employees do have such mind of trust, cooperation, partnership, but it's not very visible to Japanese companies. I'm advising a lot of Japanese companies to invest in Sri Lanka, but even such companies who are interested in investing in Sri Lanka, they don't know much about Sri Lanka. Well, they have a good impression over Sri Lanka and the Sri Lanka people, but their image of Sri Lanka is very limited. It's a good island to visit, well, some spicy foods or something like that. And that's it. And when we look at Sri Lankan companies, the people, again, they have a good impression over Japanese people, and the Japanese companies, but they don't know much about Japan. So it is very unfortunate, and they do have common things, but they don't have a good business right now. And as I said, I was in India, and that's same. Indian people does not know much about Japanese people, and Japanese people, well, maybe know better than Sri Lanka people, but they, in a real sense, they don't know, Japanese people don't know much about Indian people. But communication between Japan and India is more active than those between Sri Lanka and Japan. And nowadays, that is because nowadays, India's government is trying to promote Japanese culture as well, not only business, but also culture. I saw a lot of Japanese culture was imported to India. And likewise, to some extent, Japanese people also importing some Indian cultures to Japan. So they are learning their culture each other. So I hope Sri Lankan and Japanese people also learn each other from now on.
Thank you very much. Now we've got some interesting questions from the audience. So I thought I will maybe try to group them and get our wonderful panel to give some quick reactions. One question which any of the panel are free to answer, it's a two-part question, I guess, if I group them. What sectors in Sri Lanka might be of interest to Japanese investors? So that's one question. And then there is a specific question about Japanese interest in developing the tourism sector in Sri Lanka. So I wonder if we start with that, and maybe I can ask Koyanagi-san to start, and then Rio to go, and then maybe Maeda-san to say something. Maybe we start with that question. Thank you.
Okay, what sectors? Actually, that is another proposal I might make to Sri Lankan policymakers. Actually, I think Sri Lanka government or Sri Lanka as a state needs a mid to long-term industry policy, industry strategy. Which sectors they want to nourish and develop. And depending on that, tax regime and regulative policies might roll out, and that would change investment behaviors by Japanese companies. Actually, sorry, there's some crowd laughing outside of the tourists. I think there's many Japanese tourists coming into Sri Lanka already, but I think there's a huge upward room for development of tourism in Sri Lanka. There's so much touristic resources in Sri Lanka. I was really impressed when I was there only for 5 days. 5 days is not enough. You know, there are a lot of places to visit. And to promote tourism more in a higher level, I think Sri Lanka needs better infrastructure, better railway services and road transportation, and that would make the whole process of touring in Sri Lanka more efficient, and that would make the price to content performance a lot better for many Japanese tourists. And so there is a huge upward room for Sri Lankan tourism. That's what I think.
Thank you very much. Rio, any thoughts?
Yes. So in addition to the sector, what I'm looking at is the service sector, because the Sri Lanka has good, well-educated people, and they are fluent in English. For example, education may be a good sector to explore. So Japanese people would like to learn English from a good speaker of English. And also, maybe you can look at the education of Japanese language, because the, if you want to work with Japanese companies, of course, as I said, you can communicate in English with Japanese businessmen, but for example, if you want to co-develop a new product in Japanese manufacturing site, then Sri Lankan people may dispatch some Sri Lankan people to Japan. And for such purpose, Japanese language would help. And that would help to learn technology directly from Japanese people. For that purpose, learning Japanese language is good. From my experience in India, some Japanese companies introduced a special course in the Indian university to give a lecture about the Japanese language. The objective is that course is to have a good number of Indian young generation who can speak Japanese and who can work with Japanese companies. So that kind of trial may be helpful. And in that, I see some opportunity in such sector.
Thank you. Maeda-san, any quick comments on those questions, please?
Yes, so the sector specific, maybe my comment is not from like, Japanese companies perspective, but more like a government perspective. One interesting sector would be digital. Like after COVID-19, many countries are very interested in digital sectors and in startups maybe. Japan has, small number of IT experts, and we're looking for those experts coming into Japan. When we think about, IT experts from South Asia, we often come up with like India, as an like experts, but if Sri Lanka has a good IT experts, then that could be one sector that we can see more cooperation. And for the second question, the tourism, at this moment, I think it's quite difficult because of COVID-19. People's interaction is also difficult, but this is just my opinion. When I talk with some Japanese companies, it could be maybe like the distance. So like when I talk with like a Japanese company, they often come up with like China, South Korea, or like ASEAN, and those like closer countries rather than far from ASEAN actually. And I think like many Japanese people, not only the companies, but also like normal people, they do not know much about South Asia, to be honest. And I feel that if there are more interaction among students, or more like, maybe start from students, that could help increase the Japanese people's knowledge about Sri Lanka and South Asia.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions that are about how Sri Lankan companies can connect with Japanese partners who may be interested in investing or in trading. And maybe that's a question for Maida-san, and then maybe also Rio can just briefly comment. And then within that, there are some specific sector people who are interested in connecting with Japanese sector people. Bicycle manufacture is one. And then there is another one about Uniqlo and retail. So there are a couple of questions about how do Sri Lankan firms get information about Japanese companies properly, those based here. So maybe Maida-san, if you can answer that, and then Rio can supplement, that would be very useful, please. And then we'll get towards wrapping up. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So I think if Sri Lankan companies want to know about Japanese company, I think it's easy to first, I think get access to JETRO. They have a lot of information about Japanese companies in Japan and also in Sri Lanka. And actually they have a lot of offices in all over the world. So they can connect if they want to, even like maybe like if you ask JETRO office in Sri Lanka, well, maybe they don't know about Japanese companies in South Asia, but they can also connect to another office too. So I think Japanese JETRO would be the first point that Sri Lankan companies want to access. And also, I don't know if Sri Lankan companies have access to, a Japanese Chamber of Commerce. They also have a lot of information. And another one would be, well, maybe, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but also talking with Embassy of Sri Lanka in Japan also have a lot of information too. And then if we could get questions from Embassy of Sri Lanka, we are so happy to answer any questions. And so like starting from this seminar, I hope the conversation or communication between Sri Lanka and Japan would be deepened further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rio, any quick thought on that question of connecting Sri Lankan companies with potential Japanese partners, please?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Maeda-san. So let's start with JETRO. They have good information, and actually that is their role. Their role is to promote the business. And so when I first visited Sri Lanka, what I first visited is Colombo office of JETRO. So it's good start with JETRO. And of course, as an organization like Chamber of Commerce, and of course, even the embassy, that is also a good contact. And well, I don't think there are a lot of commercial exhibition in Sri Lanka, but if you step outside Sri Lanka, like India or Dubai, Singapore, there are some international exhibition, and some Japanese companies may participate in that event. So maybe you can visit those opportunities as well.
Thank you very much. Chandana, I realize we are coming to the end of time. Would we have another 7 minutes, or should I finish at 12:30, please?
I think as long as the speakers are okay, so of course you can go ahead with that, Dr. Kitaraja.
Thank you. Would you all be okay, speakers, if we take 10 more minutes before we close? Is that all right with you all? Thank you very much. So let me just give out a few questions, and then I'm going to ask you all to spend no more than 1.5 minutes to sort of respond in any way you want to any of them, because there is a lot of interest here. One question concerns the One Belt, One Road, and is this a competition, with Japan and the free and open Indo-Pacific? Maybe that is something Maeda-san might want to just say something briefly about. Another question is about Japanese companies having very difficult standards and making it difficult for Sri Lankan exporters. Maybe Ken, you want to talk about Japanese standards, maybe a little bit. Then I think Rio, there's another question. What has Sri Lanka got to do to attract business moving out of China? You know, if we want to get it here, I think you all did answer those. And then there's a question about Sri Lanka's free trade zones, how competitive are they, and so on. So I think maybe in your closing part, maybe take a minute and a half each to give any final thought and deal with any of these questions. And then I will try to wrap up at the end. Thank you very much. Please, why don't we start in reverse order? Rio, why don't you go first, and then Ken, and then Maeda-san, you will get the last word. We must be very gender sensitive also, I feel. Please. Thank you.
Okay, let me start. So, yes, so if you want to bring Japanese people from China, what you should do is what I said, that is, you should be visible to Japanese companies. So as far as Japanese companies know you better, I think you have a good chance, good opportunity to compete with Chinese people or Chinese companies. But currently, unfortunately, you may not be visible to Japanese companies. So let's learn Japanese companies and try to get their understanding. That is my suggestion.
Ken, any responses to the questions, the last round, or any last thoughts, please?
Okay. I think some people complain Japanese industrial standards are too strict and too detailed, probably. But I think that's Japan. We can't help it. Japanese consumers are very, very demanding. They demand very, very high quality, and they demand precise quality. So if you want to export something to Japan, you have to fulfill those standards. I think you cannot avoid it. In terms of BRI, I think Sri Lanka has a very good opportunity to take advantage of this BRI movement led by China, but kind of steal the show. I think Sri Lanka has an opportunity to do that. And finally, I think maybe a couple of tips I could give in my last words to Sri Lankan policymakers is higher education and long-term development strategy, including industry strategy. That's the fields policymakers should put a lot of energy into, and that would pave the road for Sri Lanka to develop into higher middle income economy in the near future. Thank you.
Maeda-san, please.
Yes, thank you for the question. FOIP, yes, there is a little bit of sensitivity there, but I think there are some, there are some space that Japan and China and other countries can cooperate. So let's see how it goes. I would stop there. And then also in order to summarize, I think at this moment, COVID-19 is affecting a lot of companies, not only Japan, but also all over the world. And the Japanese companies are started thinking about diversification of supply chain, that's for sure. But in order to make them think that Sri Lanka is the FDI destination, it is also important, like Japanese companies already in Sri Lanka are doing well in their business, because Japanese companies like to get information from Japanese companies already in that country. And also, finally, I think making the regulations very friendly to SMEs is very important. Only like 1% or few percent of companies in Japan are large companies, and most of them are small ones. So yes, SME friendly regulations are very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so we'll just try to wrap up. We started this session with three questions. What is the state of play of Sri Lanka-Japan relations? And we observed that Sri Lanka has had very good diplomatic ties with Japan over the years, ranging from the early time in the San Francisco conference right through to the hard work that the embassy does on a day-to-day basis. But maybe these ties need to be deepened on the economic front, and the notion of economic diplomacy, which Sri Lanka is now emphasizing as an important area to earn foreign exchange for the country, which is in scarce supply, becomes important. And so, investment FDI from Japan, varies. As we saw from Ken's presentation, it's been volatile. And I think Ken said it could go anywhere from 100 million to 1 billion. So I think that gives an interesting question of the potential. So rather than think about the negative, we need to think about the potential. And likewise, two-way trade may expand. And then also people movement of high-skilled people can move. Japan is now open to that in some way. And tourism is a big area for potential. So in terms of the opportunities, we have a lot of potential to get involved in Japanese supply chains, particularly if we link up with the Indian market and also link up with Southeast Asia. So Sri Lanka could be some sort of a hub. And then there is the more distant linking up to Africa. So that should be Sri Lanka's important locational advantage if we were to do that. Then we also talked a bit about the digital space, and I think Maeda-san talked about the possibility of Sri Lankan IT people maybe finding opportunities in Japan. Japan has a surprisingly large IT sector, which is not so well known in Sri Lanka. Beyond, the hardware manufacturers, you have a large software sector, and that is one of Sri Lanka's advantage points and very fast growing. Then we talked about education. I think it was Rio who talked about that. Both Sri Lanka as a center to teach English, but also as a place for Sri Lankans to learn Japanese, so they can have those technical conversations with Japan. Tourism is there as a potential, of course. COVID-19 pending in the future. It's an unexploited opportunity. And then Sri Lanka can also become a hub. Now, of course, there are many challenges. And the first challenge that I observe is really that Japanese don't know very much about Sri Lanka. I think it was Rio who said, you think of us as a place which is well located, maybe a beautiful island with spicy food. And, the business center aspect and what we do doesn't come out so well. So I think Sri Lankan Board of Investment, Export Development Board, and many others have to work much, much harder to get Sri Lanka on the investment map in Japan. And that is a very important strategic task. And I'm sure Chandana and colleagues are working every day to try to achieve that. Another very important area concerns getting to know Japanese business. And, I think Maeda-san very shrewdly gave us the talk that if we want to connect with Japan, we have to link up with JETRO office in Sri Lanka as a first point, and also the Japanese chamber in Sri Lanka. And that can be very much a gateway to the rest of the wider network of Japan Inc., which is very important. And then we must study Japanese business culture. And I think it was Rio who said that Japanese business culture is like any other. They expect a high degree of diligence from Sri Lankan workers. From investors, they expect cooperation and collaboration. And I think most importantly, from my own experience of Japan, is a certain transparency and predictability and rules-based sort of behavior. So my word is my bond. That is what I understood in Japan. And so I think Sri Lankans need to be very clear that that is how they're dealing with their partner, and this is what is expected. And that might differentiate Sri Lanka from India, particularly if we improve our legal system. That was one point that Ken's presentation talked about. We are sadly not up there in terms of our legal story of contract enforcement, and that is maybe an important area for government, judicial reform and legal sector reform, if we want to differentiate ourselves from India. And that is indeed critical if we want to have the port city that we're building on 249 hectares of reclaimed land from the sea, and we want to make that a commercial success. We really have to sort out these legal issues. Otherwise, there may be some stumbling blocks for Sri Lanka. And more generally, the red tape issue is there, and we have to improve Sri Lanka as a seamless place to do business in the South Asian context. It could be a beacon. And then the last point I picked up was the importance of an FTA strategy. I think several speakers talked about that. We are a very small market, and I think it was Ken's words that said that import substitution has failed. And in a small market, you have to really ensure that you are open to your neighboring countries. And that means Sri Lanka being very open to India as a gateway through an upgraded Sri Lanka-India FTA, and also likewise making the Sri Lanka-Singapore FTA actually active so that trade and investment can flow, particularly through Japanese companies and also to the wider Asia Pacific. And the last point I picked up from all of this was the real importance, which I think Ken also underlined, was a predictable, stable environment on the trade and investment side. But at the same time, and I really appreciate Ken's very valuable advice, we need to have a long-term development strategy for Sri Lanka. We need to know where we are going and how we want to achieve our ambition of actually becoming a high-income country. We became an upper middle-income country a couple of years ago, but we need to become a high-income country, and we need a pathway to achieve that. So I would really like to thank all our speakers for a wonderful and frank set of ideas, and I certainly learned a lot, and it was a very rich session. And I'd like to thank Chandana and colleagues at the Sri Lanka Embassy in Japan for putting this on, the Export Development Board, the BOI, and many others. And I hope our audience really appreciated the frank and candor from all our colleagues. Thank you so much, and goodbye, and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.